So centering Black literature in the classroom, this is an expansive kind of subject. And so one of the things that I did in order to try and pare it down and make it manageable was to think about maybe the beginning of African-American literature. And so I'll be focusing today on thinking about slave narratives and how to potentially incorporate them in the classroom. And while I'll be talking broadly about approaches to the literature and to bringing it into the classroom, that'll make much of what I say kind of portable to other moments in African-American literature. I'll be focusing specifically on the antebellum moment, okay? And here's this wonderful image by Kadir Nelson. Got a few folks here, Zora Neale Hurston, James Baldwin. Okay. So some of the central questions that I would love for us to think about. How can we use enslaved Black people's writing in the classroom? How can we teach about the history, literature, and culture of Black people without reproducing narratives of trauma and deficit thinking? These, I think, are two of my guiding questions that I want us to think about. And it's something that routinely comes up in the classroom for me with students. You know, students are oftentimes shocked that they don't know about the history and literature of Black people when they come into my classroom. And so I think it's definitely something that we can think about as a kind of guiding questions here. I've offered up some of the language from English Language Arts and Reading, the text 3, thinking about the usefulness of today's presentation and the literature in regards to state expectations and standards around English language arts. And here I pulled from section 8 and A through G. Okay, and I'll keep going. And I wanted to say a little bit about where I'm from, if you all will allow me that short convenience. I am originally from the greater Atlanta area, and specifically a suburb called Stone Mountain. And it's got in Stone Mountain Park. And here on the right side of the screen, you can see Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson, the Confederate generals and president, riding into the sunset. It's kind of emblazoned on the side of the mountain there. And what's interesting about it is that the person that originally started doing this ended up leaving this project and going to do Mount Rushmore. But I also have here this kind of pamphlet, this image that was done for the Klan on November 25th, which is unfortunately my birthday, 1915, wherein the Klan used Stone Mountain as a space to reimagine itself in the 20th century. What is very interesting about the mountain is that as a state park, it opens up 100 years to the day of Lincoln's assassination. And now in its contemporary kind of moment, it is completely surrounded by Black people. Black people live all around the mountain, use the mountain to walk, to climb up it. And you know, it is, and for me, one of the reason why I share this is because it reminds me of the history of Black people in America. It reminds me of the history of Black culture and literature, that there's always this kind of push and pull between what was, what is, and what will be. Right. And for me, as we think about monuments in this moment, as we think about all of these kind of memorials to the Confederacy, this just kind of always continues to resonate with me. Okay. So I wanted to share a few of the guiding principles that I use in approaching the classroom space, and specifically the teaching of Black literature. There are 3 kind of pillars, if you will. The first of which is power and resistance. Second, structure and agency. And third, representation and performance. And one of the things that you'll notice in each one of these pillars is this push and pull between what I'll say is kind of the dynamic of power, and then the response to that power, right? So here you've got power and resistance, structure and agency. One of the things that I talk about, because I definitely let students know about these three pillars and how they'll inform the class, is that, you know, when we're thinking about agency, we're thinking about the ways that people and literature are able to create space for themselves, for their way of life, and for thinking. And similarly, that dynamic is present in the bottom one with representation and performance, meaning how you know, a people or a group is represented by others versus how that particular group performs their own sense of self, right, and expression. Okay. And you all, you know, will have a Q&A. So if you have any questions, please ask in that moment. One of the things that I think is so important about teaching about Black literature in classrooms is being intentional with our language as educators, making sure that our students are intentional with their language, and then also making sure that we engage in a very kind of intentional pedagogy around that, right? And so what does that mean? One of the things that I think oftentimes frustrates students in the classroom, as well as myself as the teacher in the front of the classroom, is when we begin to have conversations about race and racism, when we begin to have conversation about the literature, and students not necessarily having the language that they need, begin to find the language. And when they find that language, they oftentimes find it in the most expansive ways, in broad ways as possible, right? So they end up painting with very broad brushes. And so it's important to make sure that we give students a language of specificity, right? Of being able to mean what they say and say what they mean, because oftentimes they will err on the side of broadness in ways that can be injurious to a number of folks in the room, and to our broader goals and objectives in the moment, right? And so here I've offered up some of the language that I oftentimes have students think about, especially when we're dealing with Black literature, African-American literature in the 19th century, right? And we can kind of see what that looks like here, right? For instance, I tell students that, you know, for the sake of this class and the sake of your writing, I would prefer you used enslaved people, enslaved Africans, enslaved Black people, instead of slaves. And then what this does is that this allows us to have a conversation about what the distinction between the two of those are, right? I also tell students that I believe that we can engage in historical forms of violence in this contemporary moment, right? And so what does it mean to reduce people? What does it mean to continue to reduce people to just slave, thereby potentially on a rhetorical level, continuing to rob them of their humanity, right? If we recognize that that's precisely what the designation of slave means, right? Versus recognizing in this moment that that was just a product of the system that they were in, right? They're enslaved. And similarly here, right? Instead of saying white people broadly or whiteness, really pulling and being specific with our language. It allows for students to be more rigorous with their thinking, with their writing, and with their reading practices. And that's what we want in the classroom. So here I've talked about a few of the things, and while these are potentials and pitfalls for a kind of antebellum 19th century moment, I definitely think that these are potentials and pitfalls that can happen across African-American literature. I am finishing up, I teach our survey course at Texas Christian University, and it is a course that moves from Lucy Terry bars fight in the 1700s up to the present moment, and it moves fast. And so these potentials and pitfalls have a way of recreating themselves at various moments if you're not intentional and specific. And so one of the potentials, or the main potential, is that students get to go more in depth about periods and about subject matters that routinely get glossed over in the classroom and in public discourse, right? And so students are able to find themselves oftentimes in some of this literature, and students are able to be able to really recognize a kind of robust and nuanced form of history and literature that they otherwise, up until this point, had not, right? And then the pitfalls. Students are often tired of images and conversations around slavery. They're oftentimes tired of conversations around dispossession and disenfranchisement and theft of Black folks, of their bodies, of their intellectual achievements and creative achievements. And focusing on slavery could reinforce dominant narratives about race if it is not done properly. And so I'm sure that these are some of the issues and anxieties, trepidations that folks have when it comes to Black literature. But I want us to hopefully dispel some of those issues and, provide you all, empower you all to really broach some of these subjects in the class. Okay. So one of the things that I like to do, and I really hope that this is going to do better. That looks funky. Ah, there it is. All right. One of the things that I like to start off with by talking about slavery is I use this this wonderful image that Slate created, the transatlantic slave trade in 2 minutes. It's relatively easy to find. It's on YouTube, which is where I pulled it from, but also Slate did this a few years ago. What they were able to do is they were able to take the information from manifests from slave ships, and they create these dots. So you can see these dots leaving West Africa and pouring into South America, the Caribbean, and the United States. And the size of the dot is based off of the size of the cargo, right? And by cargo here, we mean chattel slaves. 1619, we see the first dot go into what would be Virginia, right? Happening 1619 project. We really see this pick up in the 18th and 19th century when the Middle Passage, and the transatlantic slave trade becomes kind of solidified. Look at all of the dots pouring into the Caribbean and into Brazil. 1776. By 1808, 1809, we end our use of the transatlantic slave trade. Great Britain has ended slavery. We still see some ships that are traveling though. And one of the things that I focus on when I show students that image, right, is clearly the high number of enslaved people that end up going into the Caribbean and into Brazil, right? And that's a product of a few things, but really the idea that that the institution of slavery gets taken up differently in those places, right? So in the United States, in a US context, slavery takes on this kind of paternalistic, patriarchal role wherein enslaved folks become permanently infanticized on the plantation and are treated as part of the family, folks taking last names, etc. Whereas in the Caribbean and in Brazil, it was much more of a kind of bloody, cold transaction wherein you were meant to labor and oftentimes work to death. And it was recognized that it was cheaper to work you to death than it was to keep you alive, right? And so life expectancy in the Caribbean, I think at this time, was like 3 years, okay? And only 10% of Africans taken from West Africa were brought to North America, okay? Okay. One of the things that's so important about the way that we teach the institution of slavery, the way that we teach early Black literature, is finding spaces in the gap where we can allow students in this contemporary moment the ability to think about resistance, the ability to think about agency, okay? One of the things that I have here on the left is a historical document by Prince Hall, who early on in the 18th century, against the backdrop of the creation of America, is petitioning the state of Massachusetts to make good on early promises about emancipation. He is trying to figure out, right, because early on, there were assumptions that, or expectations that enslaved people would only be enslaved for their lifetime and that their children would be free. And so as those markers of emancipation end up being fuzzy and moved, he is petitioning the state to try and say, hey, you know, this is what we initially said, or hey, this is what the Emancipation Proclamation says. Can we, you know, what does this mean for enslaved people? And I bring this up because oftentimes documents become a part of like the ledger and become part of, you know, what we look at in Black literature, African-American literature. But it's important to give students the tools of being able to respond to, right, this historical assertion that Black people were not actively trying to find ways to free themselves, right? Again, one of the ways of responding to a kind of history of erasure, a history of being servile, is to give them these tools. Also, one of the things that we rarely talk about is maroonage and maroon colonies, and the way that if Black people weren't allowed or weren't able to go towards freedom, they would oftentimes create their own encampments in you know, hard to traverse swamps, or, you know, if it's Jamaica, then on the side of a mountain. But Black people have since the beginning actively tried to find freedom, right? And it's important to think about what that looks like in the literature, right? Henry Louis Gates coins this term, the talking book, right? For early Black folks that saw people reading and thinking about literacy, and people picking up a book and reading a book, and that being like a book talking to someone, right? And so oftentimes we would see these early slave narratives would have a number of different points as it pertains to these movements towards freedom, as well as these movements around literacy. And here's an image of Phyllis Wheatley, who we'll return to in just a little bit. So possible readings that I think are really great in the classroom, especially at this age, would be What to the Slave is the 4th of July, this wonderful speech by Frederick Douglass. We also have excerpts from Frederick Douglass's The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. We've got passages from Harriet Wilson's Our Nig, passages of Harriet Jacobs, about her childhood or trials of girlhood. I think Oludai Equiano would be absolutely great to teach in the class. Um, Elizabeth Keckley, behind the scenes, is a wonderful, it's like a two-part. It is part slave narrative as well as part tell-all. Elizabeth Keckley was a seamstress for Mary Todd Lincoln. And before she was a seamstress for Mary Todd Lincoln, was a seamstress for Jefferson Davis's wife when he was in the Senate. And when she was having a hard time getting paid by Mary Todd Lincoln, who was clearly having a lot to deal with after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, wrote a tell-all. And so the first part of it is how she ends up gaining her freedom. And then the second part is her time in Washington, D.C. and in the White House, and what it was like to be in the White House during this difficult moment. I would also say that more students need to read David Walker's Appeal. David Walker in 1829 wrote his appeal in pamphlet form, and it, set the 19th century world ablaze. And he is very forceful with his language, with his writing. Also, obviously not on here, but that we'll be talking about in a little bit, that I had you all read, is Phyllis Wheatley and her poetry. She is the first Black person to publish a book of poetry. And as you all read, had to go through almost insurmountable odds to be able to be credited with her intellectual and creative genius as part of that. It is, yeah, and so you have these early kind of 19th century texts that are, I think, really important, that help students maybe reimagine what it was like to be in this moment, to be writing in this moment, and what, right, if we think about, well, here, I can move forward. Components of slave narratives, right? When we're thinking about how, and you'll see even here with the parentheses I said, enslaved, some of the characteristics of slave narratives. We have white abolitionists is in the preface, right? Writing about and to kind of like essentially serve as a, to verify and validate the Black person's tale, right? And so, for instance, with Frederick Douglass, who's here to the left, you have William Lloyd Garrison, who wrote in his preface for Harriet Jacobs. You have Lydia Marie Childs. One of the other things that I think would be a great thing for students to do in the secondary ed kind of space is also think about the way that periodicals get taken up in this moment. I don't have a slide for that here, but everybody had a newspaper. Everybody had a periodical. And when we're talking about kind of early forms of written word, periodicals are so important. The Liberator, the North Star, later on with Du Bois, the Crisis. There were all of these important newspapers that served as touchstones to not only the abolitionist cause, but as Black communities were emancipated and it was no longer unlawful for Black people to be able to read, this was the way that communication traveled in Black communities, and it was so important. The second characteristic, abolitionist in nature, right? It is persuasive. So if you're thinking about rhetoric, I am recently in conversation with a teacher at Mansfield Legacy High School, right? And she does AP English 3 around rhetoric and composition. And she has her students, we're trying to figure out a good time for me to come and talk to them. She has them opening up the school year with MLK's letter in a Birmingham cell. And if we look even farther back, right, there's ways that we can think about what rhetoric and persuasive writing looks like for slave narratives, right? There's a way that because these are abolitionist texts, readers need to kind of go to the text with a discerning eye to think about, asking critical questions around why the writer frames this particular scene or this particular subject matter in these ways, right? Why is it useful? To that end, these texts are also ethnographic. They oftentimes have embedded in them literacy narratives, kind of going back to my earlier, The Talking Book. The earlier narratives had conversion narratives. And it's important to note that they oftentimes had Northern white readerships, and that thinking about, again, going back to that earlier moment about them being persuasive texts, what does that mean? And it really sets up kind of all of African American literature in thinking about what does it mean to have a kind of dual audience that Black people would routinely have to kind of negotiate, right? Here are key terms that I think are always important to bring into the classroom: abolitionism, amanuenses, or somebody else who kind of wrote the narrative or the tale for the person, and thinking about what authorship looks like in this moment, I think is very important. Antebellum, postbellum, right? Enslaved persons, people versus slave. One of the things that I talk about when I'm talking about this moment that we see a little bit in the passage that I had you all read about Phyllis Wheatley is some of the prevailing assumptions around race. And part of those prevailing assumptions around race is this idea of polygenesis, that Black people were somehow derived from a different set of people, that everybody has their own kind of genesis story associated with them as a way of being able to not entangle religious ideas around religion and Christian doctrine with this growing institution of slavery. You have manumission, freedom papers, bondage, the peculiar institution as a euphemism for slavery, right? And a way to kind of mitigate, this idea around slavery and in a country that right now, that at the time was trying to figure out how to, lead the world in this project of democracy. And then we also have the slave.